Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Andrea Telly, and I'm Commissioner of the Chicago Public Library. And on behalf of everyone here at the library and our wonderful Chicago Public Library Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to the finale of our One Book, One Chicago season. So tonight's program is part of the 2019-2020 One Book, One Chicago season that celebrated the theme of our time, probably. So the theme, Season for Change along climate change, and the book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert. This is actually almost, I didn't tell the truth here, it's almost the finale. We've got one more program left this weekend, I believe. So if you want more information about that or about the entire series, you can visit onebookonechicago.org. The 2019-2020 One Book, One Chicago program is made possible by lead support from the Joyce Foundation, Elizabeth Crown and Bill Wallace, the Morrison Family Foundation, media sponsor WBEZ 91.5 FM, travel sponsor United Airlines, and generous donors to the Chicago Public Library Foundation. The executive director of the foundation, Brenda Longstrad, is here tonight, and we really wouldn't be able to have these programs without the support of the foundation, so we thank them for this and all that they do for us. Thank you. I'd like also to give a special thanks to Craig Davis, who is our Director of Civic, Cultural, and Literary Programs, and Jennifer Lezak, who put together every year an incredible season of One Book, One Chicago programs. The book is just the beginning, and for the last several years, we've featured not only a book, but we've featured discussions and programs around a theme, and they've really done an absolutely magnificent job, so I'd like to thank them and the whole team over in Adult Services as well. Ed Miller of the Joyce Foundation is here to say a few words. We're so grateful for their partnership, and I want to recognize him here.
Thank you, Commissioner Telly, and good evening. As the Commissioner said, I work at the Joyce Foundation, where I lead our efforts to support work in Chicago and around the Great Lakes region to fight climate change. And it's really exciting and heartening to see everybody turning out tonight for this conversation. And I know we're in the overflow room as well, so really thank everyone for being here. The Joyce Foundation is proud to be a sponsor of One Book, One Chicago this year, given the focus on climate change and related environmental challenges. And I really would like to thank the other sponsors, in particular the Morrison Family Foundation and the Crown family, for joining Joyce and supporting this work. As all of you know who have read The Sixth Extinction, it's really an extraordinary book. It can be overwhelming. I know I found it that way at many points. But it has struck me that more people that I know who have read the book have actually found it to be empowering. We can't hope to make progress on climate change or biodiversity loss or other global environmental or social challenges if we don't understand how they're fundamentally interrelated. And the Sixth Extinction really helps to explain those connections. So thank you for coming this evening. I want to thank you for whatever you're already doing to try to make a difference on solving those challenges. I know for some people that's joining with other residents to try to make Chicago a more resilient city in the face of climate change. For some people that's working to protect and restore natural areas around Chicago. And others, it's joining activists and really pushing the state of Illinois and the businesses in our state to make the shift to a carbon-free energy system much more quickly. And I want to encourage everybody to continue doing those things, redouble your efforts, get more involved. It's critical. We need all of those efforts. And without taking up more time, I'll turn it back to Commissioner Telly to get us into the heart of the presentation tonight.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our esteemed guest this evening. Elizabeth Kolbert has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1999. Her stories have also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, and Mother Jones, and have been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing and the Best American Political Writing. Her series on global warming, The Climate of Man, appeared in The New Yorker in the spring of 2005 and won the American Association for the Advancement of Science Magazine's award. Elizabeth has traveled from Alaska to Greenland and has visited top scientists to get to the heart of the debate over global warming. Growing out of that series, her book, Field Notes from a Catastrophe, brings the environment into the consciousness of the American people and asks what, if anything, can be done and how we can save our planet. Elizabeth has received numerous awards and honors for her work, including the National Academy of Sciences Communication Award, the Heinz Award, the National Magazine Award, the Sierra Club's David R. Brower Award, the Walter Sullivan Award for Excellence in Science Journalism, and the Blade Dodd Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2019, the Pell Center Prize for Story in the Public Square was awarded to Elizabeth. Her book, The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, a book about mass extinctions that weaves intellectual and natural history with reporting in the field, was a New York Times 2014 top 10 best book of the year and is #1 on the Guardian's list of the 100 best nonfiction books of all time. The Sixth Extinction also won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize in the general nonfiction category and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Awards for the best books of 2014. We are so thrilled. I had been so thrilled to see thousands of Chicagoans read the book this season. It was wonderful to see it on trains and on people's devices and all around the city. Elizabeth will be interviewed by a longtime friend of Chicago Public Library, Donna Seaman. Donna is book list editor for adult books, is a recipient of the Lewis Shores Award for Excellence in Book Reviewing, the James Friend Memorial Award for Literary Criticism, and the Studs Terkel Humanities Service Award. Donna is a member of the content leadership team for the American Writers Museum, and her most recent book is Identity Unknown: Rediscovering 7 American Women Artists. And so finally, before I welcome our guests to the stage, please silence your phones and other personal devices, and we will get started with our program this evening. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth and Donna to the stage.
Wow, this is a full house. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So honored to be sitting here with Elizabeth Kolbert. There's nothing more important than the environment, than the living world, of course. I've been a big admirer of the Sixth Extinction since it came out, and I was thrilled when it was chosen for the One Book, One Chicago. What a perfect book. So I want to begin, Elizabeth, with how you draw us in. You know, a lot of people are a little resistant to science. Some people come to it very naturally. Other people, like myself, need a story to learn difficult concepts and scientific facts. There's a lot of scientific history and facts and theories and debates in this book, and you pull us through it with your experiences in the field. So I wonder if you could talk about that back and forth balance.
Sure. Now, but just before I answer Donna's question, I just want to say very briefly, because I don't want to bog us down here, I also want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank everyone who put in so much effort into this One Book, One Chicago program. I was really, it gives me hope. One of the few things these days that gives me hope is to see all of you here today and to see all the great work that went on, and so I'm very grateful. So I want to just begin by saying that. Now, as to how the book, how I came to the sort of structure of the book, I think it's, I am not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. I majored actually in German literature in college. And I took one science class. I took my freshman year, I did have scientific sort of aspirations, and I took a physics class the very first semester I got to college, and I still remember the final involved an ant walking across the turntable, a moving turntable, and I was completely flummoxed by that. And I never took another science class. So I am a complete, STEM dropout. And my own experience actually, maybe speaks to women in STEM and all sorts of other issues, but the basic point is if I'm not interested in something myself, I don't expect my readers to be interested in it. So I am the reader, I stand in for the reader in my encounters with all these scientists. And I tried, in doing that seemed to be the only possible way. There are doubtless many other ways that you could have come at a lot of these subjects. But for a journalist who's not a scientist, it seemed like the only way to bring this subject alive was to get out in the field with people, which is a very classic journalistic, trick, as it were. It's not exactly a great, original structure, but that seemed to me the only way to do it.
We try to find hope, as Ed said in his introductory remarks, and I found in rereading the book that the studies you describe, these unbelievably demanding, painstaking studies out in the field that people devote their lives to, really did sort of have a positive effect. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the scientists you work with.
Well, a lot of the scientists, in the book, I personally have a lot of admiration for them. They are, and it's, it was a tremendous experience to go out in the field with them because, first of all, they knew what they were doing, which, if you or I tried to just, go to some of these places, we would, I don't want to say probably not survive, but, it's not impossible. So that was just the level of competence is extremely high, and the level of knowledge is super high, and the level of commitment is super high. So, some of the people that I went into the field with are just the top people in that field, and their dedication, as you say, is very inspiring, and many of them have not just their own. For example, Miles Silman, someone I went to Peru with, a really great guy, and he, they're not just doing their science. I think increasingly scientists feel like we've got to be out there, active, doing something because this problem is so huge. So a lot of them are also, they're not just great top scientists, but they also have other projects where they're really trying to make a difference in the places that they're studying.
Right. I mean, any science writer, any environmental writer also, you find yourself having to contribute and be more, not an activist, but more of a consciousness raiser. When this book came out, it was galvanizing and shocking, and now, these years later, it's prescient. And I wonder if you could bring us up to date on any of the places you went to and visited.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, very kind of, unfortunate, but also, I suppose from an authorial point, I told you so kind of perspective, is that a lot of things, since the book was written, I could write the book again with an even stronger argument, and only, 6 years have passed since then. So that's pretty frightening. So, I'll just give you one example. I went to the Great Barrier Reef. That was like back in 2010, I guess. The Great Barrier Reef, I'm sure many of you know this, you've read about it. There was a big bleaching event. So an effect of very warm water. There's this, formation called the blob that sat in the Pacific for 2 years. It also wreaked havoc in Hawaii, on Hawaii's reef. So the Great Barrier Reef between around 2016, 2017 had back-to-back bleaching events, and a good, serious expanses of the reef are now dead, basically, because of that. So if I were writing the book again now, and I had those updated figures in, it would be, that much more alarming. I can go on and on. I mean, white nose, which was really just getting going, the disease that was affecting the bats, that's now, when I last looked, I mean, it's once again something that's constantly being updated. It was in 33 states. It's jumped all the way to the West Coast now. And 5 Canadian provinces. So that's something that continues to sweep around the world. So unfortunately, Suchi, the Sumatran rhino, unfortunately passed away not long after I met her, and she was a wonderful, I was going to say a wonderful person, which is not really. She's kind of a person. She's really, really a fantastic creature, a magnificent creature, and I feel very fortunate to have spent some time with her, standing, right up against her. And now there are no Sumatran rhinos left in the U.S. Because the situation is so desperate. They sent all the ones that were in the U.S. To Indonesia in a really desperate attempt to keep this species alive, and it's absolutely hanging by a thread. There are now considered to be, it's widely believed there's fewer than 100 left on the planet. That's a really bad place to be. So that's just a couple of the updates I can give you.
Yeah, all very disturbing. It's interesting, we think about animals, elephants, you can relate to them. We feel heartbroken when we hear what happens to them. But one of the aspects of your book, and this is an environmental issue that's pretty much invisible to most of us, which is ocean acidification. That is a terrifying situation. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the sort of inspirations actually to write the book was I wrote a book on climate change back in 2005-06, and after I wrote that, some scientists came to me and said, well, that's all well and good, that was good of you to do, but you really missed the whole other half of the story, which is ocean acidification. And so at that point, a lot of this research was really just getting going. That's another case where, wherever you look, there are, pretty bad signs. But, ocean acidification is a really underreported story in a lot of ways. It can be very hard, I should say, to tease out the, what's pollution, what's heating up the oceans, what's acidifying the oceans. But the very sobering thing about ocean acidification, and this is, I do talk about this in the book, is it should be really hard to change the chemistry of the oceans. It's just not something that happens very often. The oceans are very well buffered. They're really, really big. They have a lot of water, and they have a lot of, not just water, but minerals that tend to keep the chemistry pretty stable. And for a long time, people didn't believe you could acidify the oceans. It just seemed incredible to them. And then people started to do sort of the basic kind of, chemical equations, and they were like, oh man, you can. You stick enough CO2 up there, you can actually change the pH of the oceans. And massive research efforts later, we certainly know that's true. And it's actually kind of a weird thing that we argue about climate change. No one argues about ocean acidification. You can just stick, you could just, I don't know exactly what the equipment is, but you can measure the pH of the oceans. You can watch it go down, and it's actually weirdly not become part of this politicization of climate change. But arguably, in the history of life on Earth, it is the biggest thing we're doing right now, is changing the chemistry of the oceans.
And that could cause a collapse of marine life at some point, couldn't it? I mean, it destroys shellfish and coral. And
well, it makes it harder, to it changes the energetics basically of creating a shell or a coral reef out of calcium carbonate, absolutely, and definitely, part of what is afflicting reefs right now is probably also ocean acidification. Sort of the warming is more acute, but the ocean acidification impacts are probably making it harder for reefs to recover. And if you look, really, you take the really long view of the history of life, which I do try to do in the book to a certain extent. There are what are called reef gaps in the fossil record, times when reefs collapsed. And they are really bad moments in the history of life. So, when you think about, are we pushing reefs? And I was actually just in Australia a couple months ago, and all of the talk was, how are we going to save the reefs? We know we're going to get to these temperature thresholds that we know they don't like, that they can't tolerate. So how are we going to save some remnant of the reef that could then, in some future, when, something has happened to make things better, repopulate the seas? So that's the way people are talking now.
Wow, that's disturbing. Excuse me. You mentioned that you talk about the previous extinction, so I want to take us out of the emergency present and look back. What's so fascinating about a lot of what you talk about was how hard it was for scientists to kind of accept the fossil record. The amazing debates, the theories, and to try and put it together, and what there were extinctions and the whole idea of the asteroid hitting the Earth. I wonder if you could talk about some of the characters, the figures that you bring up and portray.
Yeah, sure. So that was actually one of the really fun parts of the book, was this sort of the intellectual history, which really began in sort of French Revolutionary times with Georges Cuvier, this totally forgotten figure, but who was a giant of his time, who's the person who really realized, wow, things go extinct, and that began, and he was incredibly influential. It's hard to overstate. He was definitely the most influential naturalist until Charles Darwin came along. And then there was this real rejection. He was what got called a catastrophist. He believed that life had experienced a lot of catastrophes, which he called revolutions on the surface of the Earth, perhaps an allusion to the French Revolution. And then the British came along, and Charles Lyell, who's a towering figure for any of you who have studied geology, and decided that everything on Earth happens very slowly. And he just sort of decided that, once again, without, things mostly happen very slowly, but it doesn't follow that they always happen very slowly. But he was such a towering figure in the history of geology, and Cuvier was so thoroughly rejected that when, in the 20th century, the 80s, people decided there had been catastrophes on the history of the Earth, they were also vilified, treated as kind of idiots, until, once again, the evidence really mounted up that, yes, indeed, and this all really revolved around the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous, which is now just more or less taken as fact, that an asteroid ended the reign of the dinosaurs, and the reason that we're sitting here today. Our ancestors were these tiny shrew-like creatures that lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs, and then we got rid of them, and there was a lot of space. There was a lot of ecological space that, for reasons no one can actually explain, mammals took over, and here we are 66 million years later, for better or worse.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to ourselves. You use the word weedy to describe our species.
That's a quote. That's a quote.
Excuse me. But you also could say that we're the extinguishing species. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the scientists that said that we were weedy, and what does that really mean? And, give us an idea of what we've done. You say that we've remixed flora and fauna unlike any other species ever.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, and this also gets back to that intellectual history, is most of, science, the scientific revolution, the great scientific insights of the last few hundred years have tended to, put people in their place, right? So, it wasn't that the sun revolved around the earth, it was that the earth revolved around the sun. It wasn't that we were some special, creature that had been placed here, for dominion over all the species. We are just one animal that descended, via natural selection, just like everything else. So these were insights that tended to, diminish the significance of people in the cosmos, as it were. And, in the cosmological sense, I guess we're still pretty insignificant. But on planet Earth, we turn out to be, pretty damn significant. And so we have to readjust our minds to get our minds around that again. And I think that we are starting to do that, but that has also been somewhat slow. There's still a lot of sense, humans can't really do that. Could we really do that? Can we really change the atmosphere? Can we change the chemistry of the oceans? Can we change the whole distribution of life on Earth? And the answer to all of those questions turns out, unfortunately, to be yes. If you're technologically savvy enough, if you dig up enough fossil fuels, if there are almost 8 billion people on the Earth, which also I want to say is unprecedented. It's E.O. Wilson has said our, rate of population growth is more bacterial than mammalian. It has never happened. There's never been another mammalian species. We have we're very slow to reproduce. There's never been another species that has the population, a mammalian species that has the population curve that we have. So all of these ways in which we and our technology, which is sort of, increasingly an extension of ourselves, is incredibly powerful. It just turns out, it's not something that you would necessarily have predicted if you were, sitting here 500 years ago, but it has turned out to be the case.
Yes, this reminds me of one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons. There's a celestial doctor out in the cosmos looking at Earth and saying to her, "I'm very sorry, but you have humans." So, this brings me to ask you about the Anthropocene. When you were writing your book, you talked about, and maybe you'll tell us about the scientists that coined that. There were some other possible terms for this. Has that become an official term now?
Well, that's a really interesting issue, too. So the Anthropocene was kind of popularized. It wasn't exactly coined. There's a little bit of debate here. But anyway, popularized by a Dutch scientist named Paul Crutzen, who was one of the 3 scientists who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for having discovered ozone-depleting chemicals. So, had they not done that, once again, I don't want to say we wouldn't be here, but we would be in deep, deep trouble. And so, he had a lot of credibility. He has a lot of credibility. And he sort of popularized this term back in 2004. And then a group of British scientists led by a very, very nice British geologist named Jan Zelasowicz, decided to sort of take it up as an actual question in geology. Have humans impacted the Earth in such a way that if you were a reasonably competent geologist, 10, 20, 30, 40 million years from now, you could look back on the geological record, right? So you have to sort of project forward, what are we going to leave behind? And is its mark going to be great enough to justify calling this a new geological epoch? And that question is going to come up again at the huge, International Geological Convention, World Geological Congress, or whatever it is. I believe this year. I believe it's in New Delhi this year. And we'll see what happens. But unofficially, so that's the official word, unofficially, it has certainly taken over. It's in all the scientific literature. You see it all the time. And I think, I've read a lot of the papers. I'm not a stratigrapher. I think the evidence is quite compelling. And the marker that people have decided, geologists have decided is probably the best marker, is the radioactive, radionuclides that were produced with the bomb tests, the above ground nuclear tests, from the 40s through the 50s and 60s, that will leave a more or less permanent and coterminous, right? So it's all the same time, the same moment. You can say that's when it started.
Yes, indeed. I just read a really interesting book called Future Fossils by David Ferrier, and he talks about the bomb and plastic, and that, you know, that will actually leave a mark in the geological.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sort of new term which he probably talks about, technofossils, right? Like, so all our iPhones, all that crap that was made out of fossil fuels, right? So it is carbon based. Will fossilize, yeah. So people have sort of been thinking about that. That's another sort of layer, you know, when you think about it, that will look really, really weird many millions of years from now.
Yeah, it's just amazing. I mean, people have been talking about pollution and plastic for decades, and all the worst case scenarios are happening. It's very disturbing.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I guess so. Kind of wheeling around to what does one do? I'm a great believer in information is power, and feel that, you know, reading books like The Sixth Extinction and really help us understand what's happening, give us a way to talk about it and to ask questions. We're in a time when science is being unfunded, scientists are being silenced, things are being taken off of websites. Not to get terribly political, but this is a dangerous time. So I wonder if, as a science writer and a journalist, if you feel that there's an opportunity for the private sector to step up and kind of do what the government is failing to do.
Well, I think that we live in, you know, a really weird, let's just use that word, you know, moment, a sort of schizophrenic moment where there's never been, you know, sort of more information, more known about these subjects. I do think, you know, polls show, and I have no reason to disbelieve them, that more and more Americans and more people around the world, you know, rank climate change at least as a, you know, one of their top concerns, as well they should. But meanwhile, we have in the U.S. and sadly other parts of the world a backing away from the commitments that were made, you know, 5 years ago in Paris, and you know, so and in all this, we do have a lot of companies stepping in and making big commitments. You know, BP just said they were going to go carbon neutral, which, you know, I really would like to see if you're digging fossil fuels out of the ground. But okay, you know, go for it. So, you know, there's a lot of obviously pressure. They obviously feel, a lot of companies, especially fossil fuel companies, feel pressure to, you know, put on a green face, as it were. Now, can they really, you know, substitute for smart policy? Probably not. But they can accomplish, you know, a lot. And one of the things that they can accomplish is creating, you know, cheaper and better ways of producing the things that we do now with fossil fuels. So it will be, I would never want to rely on that. We've seen this again and again, commitments that don't get fulfilled. And we see this on a state and sadly even a city level. I saw as part of this One Book, One Chicago, someone did a really good look back at the promises that had been made about Chicago, greening Chicago. And some of them had been kept and some of them hadn't been. And some of them there were simply no data on even, you know, people just hadn't even collected the data. So I think that this is such a huge problem and time is so short. All the arrows have to point in the same direction. You can't have some arrows pointing in one direction and some arrows pointing in the other, and that's the challenge of our time.
Yes, thank you. Well put. So I want to name a couple of people that have been on the environmental stage lately. Greta Thunberg. What a phenomenon.
Yeah, incredible. Just an amazing young woman. I've never met her, but she talk about, you know, speaking truth to power. Yeah, absolutely. Very gutsy young woman.
And, you know, listening to her and watching her, you know, you realize that this I mean, I think there is a generational divide to some extent. Do you see that in awareness and willing to commit to change?
Well, I think that there's a real level of awareness among young people, which I think is great and important. But I think that the question of what do we do is still up to the people in power. I hope, and I really pray that we're going to see, young people are historically, they don't vote in the same proportion as older people. I really hope that changes. That would absolutely flip, the 2020 election if young people voted. So, yeah, I hope that energy that is out there gets converted into political action.
Yes, absolutely. I've voted every chance I could vote since I was old enough. I cannot understand people that don't exercise their right to vote. It's a privilege, it's a civic duty. People all over the world die for lack of being able to vote, so that just seems urgent, and I feel that this possibly is the movement that will change that. So I said I was going to name a couple of people. So here's the opposite of Greta. Jeff Bezos, the richest guy in the world, they say, Amazon, has pledged $10 billion. Can something like that actually help?
Well, there's been a lot of, chatter that I've been following just in the 48 hours since he said he was going to do that. It's a lot of money, and it's very vague what it's going to. So, many people have tried to step into that breach, like, Jeff, here are a couple things you ought to spend your money on. And one of the suggestions that I read, which I thought was really smart, was to use a state as a lab. Like, let's decarbonize Illinois. Let's show how it can be done. And that would be a huge, we need sort of a virtuous cycle of proving that it can be done, and then other things will follow from that. Costs will drop, know-how will increase, and others can follow suit. But everyone sort of, reinventing the wheel constantly is very, very inefficient. So I thought that was a really smart idea. $10 billion absolutely could make a big difference, both in R&D terms, in actually moving things from concept to realization. But it's not that much money. I mean, it would be a lot of money in your pocket, but it's not that much money to transform the entire fossil fuel infrastructure of the world. So it does have to be deployed strategically, and I hope that he will hire really good people to advise him.
Yes, exactly.
I hope he'll actually follow through.
Right. I mean, philanthropy is great, except it has to be followed through. I guess I've always been a little sort of cynical about change because somebody has to get rich to actually do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, some other people have made the point, and I, just throw this out there that, they would be more impressed if they, completely transformed Amazon, which is obviously, everyone racing around so that you can get your next day package is not exactly, environmentally sound. So, that would be the step one, and then step two would be these other things. But, you take your $10 billion, where you can get them, I guess.
I guess I feel like there must be sort of a tipping point where renewable energy just starts making BP a lot more money than fossil fuels. I don't know that we can wait that long, but I always feel that that's why they stall. They all know that they need to do this, but that just waiting, sucking every dollar they can out.
Well, it's not even that. It's who's going to control the energy future, right? I mean, if I'm, BP or whatever, I'm very good, and I actually own a lot of fossil fuel assets that, people are talking about. Once again, you all know this, a carbon bubble, right? So if I say I can't burn that oil, well, then I have all these stranded assets, and suddenly the valuation of my company goes way, way down. So right now, putting up, solar, per kilowatt hour is in many parts of the world, as cheap or cheaper even than running existing coal plants. But, there's a lot of inertia in the system, and there's a lot of vested interest in the system, and that is huge, obviously.
Yeah, it's complicated. So what other stories have you been following? I know when we were first in touch, Australia was burning. So do you want to talk about the wildfires?
Yeah, I actually was in Australia right before the fire. Some of the fires were already burning, but it wasn't before the really big, huge blazes that made international news. And one of the things that I was doing there actually was hanging out. It was also the coral spawning, which is something that I was lucky enough to see when I was there for the Sixth Extinction. It was another spawning. I was not out on the reef, but they were doing all these sort of experiments trying to find these heat-resistant corals, trying to sort of breed up corals that could resist bleaching. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is, now that we sort of see all these tremendous problems, what are we going to do about them? So that is one case of people trying to do something. When I describe it, it doesn't necessarily sound like it's going to work, and they're not under any delusions about that. But there's a lot of feeling out there in Australia and everywhere. Well, we can't just let coral reefs, go without a pretty big fight. So there's a lot of people in Australia looking at that. So that was one of the stories that I was down there to report.
Right. That's, there's this sense that that human ingenuity got us into this trouble. Perhaps it can get us out of it. Is that?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a really big one, and that is, I think, really kind of the question of our time. And we're in, as our destructive capabilities grow, all of our capabilities are growing. So gene editing. I was also visiting some people down in Australia who are doing some pretty interesting things in terms of gene editing. Are we going to figure out ways to create, for example, a coral that's heat resistant, right? We could find a heat resistance gene in some other organism, and we could now, with CRISPR, we could just edit that into the corals potentially. So there's all sorts of, potentially Frankensteinian kind of stuff that we could be doing. We're going to have to decide if, there's A, the question of whether it will work, and then there's B, the question of whether that's the future that we want. And these are really big questions. I think that the future is racing at us very fast. So all of these things are going to rise higher and higher up, up the level of urgency.
It would really help to have people in power that understood all these scientific issues. I hate to bring up another difficult subject, but I'm sitting here thinking about pollinators. I'm thinking of the things that are not obvious to us, but I think the insect population is just plunging, birds, bats.
Well, insects are that would have been a great chapter for the Sixth Extinction. But just in the last few years, and I actually just wrote a piece about this for National Geographic that'll be out in a couple months, about what people are finding as they look at insect populations, and it's pretty bad. They're where, I don't want to say wherever we look, but in a lot of places, including there was just a study, you might have read about mayflies in the Midwestern U.S., where they actually used, footage from the air to measure these huge clouds of mayflies, and those scientists concluded that mayfly populations have dropped very substantially over the last few decades. And we see big drops in Europe, we see big drops when people have looked in some studies in New England. There's a study out of Costa Rica. So there's some really dramatic declines in insects, and many people have noted just what's called the windshield effect. You just don't, see moths splattered against your windshield the way you used to when we were kids. That's actually, honestly, couldn't be more frightening, because there's nothing more important to the world as we know it than insects. But people don't know exactly. A lot of scientists are working on it, and they don't have a very clear explanation? Is it pesticides? Is it herbicides? Is it climate change? People have a lot of different theories right now and are trying to get some clarity on that.
Thank you. Bad news. And I listen to you and I think of all the people that say silly things like, well, a warmer winter is good, or I hate insects. I mean, so we really need, excuse me, need to know why insects are so crucial and what role they play, that other creatures eat them and plants depend on them, and that great interconnectivity.
Yeah, I mean, insects, they can be annoying, but insects make the world go round. I mean, insects, you can't have flowering plants without insects. That's kind of a bummer. You can't have a lot of the things we eat without insect pollination. Insects are important seed dispersers. A lot of seeds make special little, sacks of goo, basically, that insects like to carry around. They eat off this little sack, and they carry your seed around. So, without insects, or as insects plunge, and people are looking at this too, are you getting your seeds spread around? Are you going to have, we look at these forests now, and they may even look to us healthy, relatively healthy, but if they're emptying out, they're just basically living, they're living on borrowed time. And 100 years from now, what will the forest look like is a really, really key question without insects and other animals to spread seeds around. Insects are, crucial decomposers. Our soil depends on insects doing sort of that first round of decomposition before, microbes get at things. So insects, and as you were saying, they are the crucial food source for many of our bird species. I'm sure most people here tonight probably read that study that we've lost more than a quarter of our birds in North America since 1970. And once again, no one has a clear explanation of why, but insectivorous birds were particularly hard hit. So perhaps it's because they don't have any food. So, bats and birds and many reptiles depend on insects as their sole food source. So that obviously would have huge ripple effects through entire food chains.
Indeed. That reminds me of a part of your book that I was really struck by. We've all seen footage of melting ice on the poles, ice shelves, Greenland. But you explain that actually global warming in the tropics is a much bigger issue because there's so much more life there.
There's so much more life. The diversity of life here, in the upper Midwest, where I live, in New England, all these places that were, glaciated until 12,000 years ago. Everything that's here now, has just moved back in the last 12,000 years. So we live in relatively impoverished, sort of diversity-wise parts of the world. You go to the tropics, and any of you have been to the rainforest, really know, you feel it. You feel this incredible profusion of life that we just don't have up here in parts of the world where the temperature swings so wildly. But the sort of flip side to having so many species in such a relatively small area is that those species are very narrowly adapted, and that's something that I talk about in the book. And it does bring us back to insects. One of the theories about why insects are doing badly, insects in the tropics in particular, is that they have evolved to only pay attention to a couple of cues, because the climate has been very stable in the tropics for a very long time. And as you change those cues, things are getting out of sync with each other in ways that could be really devastating. So I just read a paper out of Costa Rica that blamed climate change for these plunging insects numbers that they're seeing.
Well, I have to say that you also evoke a deep sense of wonder in us by your descriptions of how things work, that sort of specific symbiotic relationships that go on between species, the incredible beauty and complexity of life on Earth. It's such an incredibly choreographed world, and it really is precious and deserves all of our attention and protection. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to open this up to questions from the audience. I know you have many. All right, first hand up over here. Are we doing microphones?
If you want to come down to the microphone to ask your question, that would be best so we can all hear. And we have limited time, so we want questions, not comments. I think you know what I mean. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. In your presentation today, I sort of see two polarities, and maybe I'm imagining it. One is how do we slow things down in terms of how we're artificially impacting the environment? Where do we invest there? And then the other one I keep hearing about is how are we going to adapt? On the other hand, like you talked about the coral, saying how can we use CRISPR? And a lot of conservatives are talking about, well, we'll just adapt rather than stop it. So can you talk about these two things and how do you balance them? Where do you invest?
Well, there's a phrase in the climate change world, and it doesn't apply to, sort of the poor corals, but it applies to us and what we're going to do, which is that it is, we need to adapt to things. We need to adapt to manage what we can't avoid, and we need to avoid what we can't manage. We're going to have to. There's a lot of climate change happening. There's a lot of it built into the, sort of as climate scientists would say, in the pipeline, because there's a lot of time, a lot of inertia in the system. So all across the world, people are looking at what are we going to do? Building seawalls in Boston, in New York, in San Francisco. And that's going to be, hugely expensive and hugely disruptive, but we're probably going to do it. We're probably going to have to do it. But meanwhile, there are levels of, change that we simply, it's very hard to imagine how we could adapt to it. So, just waving your hands and saying, oh, let's adapt to that, that's not really a plan. I don't consider that a plan. And the thing that's really important to keep in mind about climate change, but although it really applies to all these issues, is you don't get a stable climate. You don't reach climate stability until you level off the CO2 in the atmosphere. And to do that, you basically would have to cut emissions, 90%, let's say. So we are not adapting to one climate. We are adapting to a constantly changing climate. And you can see how that's really not possible. So I think at this point, because we've sat on our hands for such a long time, it's now clear, a lot of adaptation is going to be required. But you don't want to, what are we arguing over? We're arguing over don't get yourself and your kids and your grandkids in a situation that simply cannot be adapted to.
For decades, we've been saving the endangered species of the cranes, the whooping cranes and the sandhill cranes, and had the crane chicks follow humans. But now I understand that there are some states where their hunting season allows them to shoot cranes. So how is that helping the balance when they were almost endangered and now we're hunting them?
Well, I can't speak to that in particular, but it's a very common problem. We spend a lot of money and time and effort trying to bring back, wolves in this country who were really hunted almost to extinction. And then we reintroduce hunting, right? Because we are not very bright, what can I say? So that gets back to this sort of schizophrenia of our society.
We all have to eat to live. One of the quotes that Paul Crutzen did in your book, the Dutch chemist who used the term Anthropocene age, said fertilizer plants produce more nitrogen than is fixed naturally by all terrestrial ecosystems. And what happens is we see that with harmful algal blooms on Lake Erie, with miles of algal blooms on the Ohio River and the Maumee River. So we really need to move to a more regenerative agriculture that keeps microbial life in the soil, that has the soil hold capacity for water, that we don't get the runoff into our lakes and waterways. So I would think, you know, going along with what you were noticing about the pollinators and the insects, a more regenerative agriculture when we are not using and dependent upon all these various chemicals would seem to me a hopeful ray, something that we can do, along with agroforestry, more perennial plants. So I think there is some hope out there, and I see it in people's interest in knowing how their food is sourced and being more aware of what they're eating into their own bodies and feeding their children.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I think that you know, the carbon cycle is one cycle that we're, you know, increasingly aware of that we've disrupted, but we've also very significantly disrupted the nitrogen cycle, absolutely, by, you know, creating synthetic fertilizers and dumping a lot of nitrogen on the soil, which then washes, you know, down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, et cetera. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. I know that every journalist and author start a project with a vision, and often that vision shifts and changes over time and through research. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what your initial vision was.
Well, that's such a good question. Actually, what happened to me is I, you know, when you write a book, you usually, if you're a journalist, you write a proposal, you try to sell the book so that you have, you know, the wherewithal to do the reporting, and the reporting for this book was pretty expensive. So that's what I did for this book. And then somewhere along the line, I started to deviate from my own proposal, and that was really a big mistake and cost me really probably maybe a year's worth of work. So there are, you know, there's a whole chapter that never made it in the book. So actually, it wasn't that the project changed so much as that I abandoned I got lost in a dark wood, and then I had to regain the path back. But yes, everyone has their own circuitous, well, some people probably do follow the straight path, but mine was very circuitous, unfortunately.
As we change from mere awareness of the situation toward trying to hash out what to do, what we must do, do you have a set of views on the carbon tax, carbon dividend proposals?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, once again, I'm not an economist, I'm not a policy person, but I think there's a pretty broad consensus, once again, in the policy world that would be what a sane society would do. It wouldn't necessarily solve your problem. So this is, you'd put a tax on carbon, and then you could even refund that money to people in different ways, but it would change the incentives, and it would create a much more, sort of level playing field or not a level, it would unlevel the playing field, or, for renewable energy. That would be the first step, and that it should be global, because another problem with, which raises all sorts of equity problems. So it's not an easy issue, but certainly, and there are there are states and not states, but British Columbia has a carbon tax. There are schemes. The Northeast has a cap and trade scheme that's sort of like a carbon tax. So they do exist, and they've been quite effective. So yeah, let's do it. Let's just do it. I think that other things would also be necessary, but that would certainly be what a rational society would do. Absolutely.
Hi, my name's Tony Harris. I'm a retired forensic chemist, and I thought I was following climate change quite well, and then I read your book and was horrified to read that we're going to lose the coral reefs in 50 to 80 years. That's I don't think any of us deserve to have any hope unless we're engaged in serious activism. But, so I found your book rather illuminating. I wouldn't say it was enjoyable, but it was important. Also, you talk about habitat loss as being one contributor to extinction. And now that I'm retired, I'm an amateur astronomer, and what I see very alarming is the extensive growth of light pollution that is leading to habitat loss. Darkness is a critical habitat, and wherever I travel, wherever I go, I just see this unrelenting growth of artificial light at night. And in Chicago, the new LEDs, they were supposed to curb this. They don't. They're really pretty bad for the environment. And the other thing also is that you're following Javon paradox, where LEDs make light so cheap that now there's more of it than ever, and we're not saving any electricity. So in fact, actually in Chicago and suburbs, the lights come on like a half hour before sunset. So we probably got lighting going for, all over the place for another hour every day. And I mean, before reading your book, that was really annoying. It's heartbreaking now because there is a cost for that, a tremendous cost. I mean, we're poisoning our world with CO2, I mean, and destroying coral reefs. So what can citizens do to try and alert the municipalities? I mean, you alluded to Chicago in the past, and recently having these green agendas, but when you follow them through, the agenda seems to get lost. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the light pollution issue, which I also was probably not as aware of as I should be, but in researching this piece about insects, people kept pointing out, insects, when you leave the light on your porch, you're basically just inviting all the insects, and then you're inviting whatever eats the insects, and it's like becomes, an insect killing site. And that light pollution may be a very serious part of what's happening to insects. I don't think we know that, but it really made me look at I also look where I live, which is sort of more rural-ish, but people leave the lights on all night like as if it's a safety thing or whatever, and it's very, very damaging. So I think that is the kind of thing where more public awareness could potentially make a big difference. I think people simply don't think about it, and that if we gave them a public education campaign around light pollution could actually make a big difference potentially.
Hi, Elizabeth. I really just have to thank you for your work and to the Chicago Public Library. This summer I had a big moment of needing to square up with the crisis and deciding whether or not it needed to be my life's work, which it does. And I think that's just thank you for...
Thank you.
To all of you for helping me with that. I know that it is going to become my work, so I would like to hear what your experience has been speaking about it, what effectiveness and troubles you've ran into as someone who's been doing this for so long.
Well, I am more of a, I do these things that are more of a, almost like a hit and run, So I think that, and so I really think that the important work to be done, to put it back on you, is the organizing and the staying in one place and really doing the hard work of getting the pieces to fit together. And Chicago's a good place to start, and there is a lot going on, and there are a lot of people who want to do something, but getting, once again, all the arrows lining up in the right direction, it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of pushing on systems that maybe are pointing in different directions.
My question was specifically to the speaking about
Speaking?
it, though, yeah.
In the sense of, like, is it hard or easier?
Writing or speaking live, what you find to be, what your experience has been speaking and encountering the public with words?
Well, I think that, I am a journalist, and I do most of my communicating with people, from behind a computer, so not at all face-to-face. I think that there's a lot of value, obviously, to speaking to people face-to-face. You do communicate in different ways, but I it's not me, I'm not a big public speaker. That's not what I do best. I feel like I'd rather be behind a computer, but I actually think that there is a very big need, for people who are good public speakers to get out there and really rally the troops. So I do think, and people respond differently to different things. Some people are going to respond to what they read. Some people are never going to read it, and so they need to be spoken to.
Thank you.
I was curious your view with the other industry that contributes to climate change, the agriculture industry, just what your view is on the role that the private sector, the public sector can play, both in terms of issues around emissions as well as deforestation.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that, it's really hard. We don't, most of us, we go to the store, we don't know exactly where things are coming from, we don't know how they were grown. We are all, indirect participants in the deforestation that's going on because of what we're consuming, whether we, want to be or not. It's very, very hard to avoid. That being said, I think also all of these campaigns around educating people, right, about, palm oil and all of these things that are, particularly destructive, are really important. Now, I also have to say, in the interests of full disclosure, there are billions and billions of people alive. They're alive because of synthetic fertilizers. We could argue we're all alive because of synthetic fertilizers. So it's very hard. Revamping agriculture is crucial. It's super important, and it's really, really hard because there are only going to be more and more people to feed as the century goes on.
I recently was at a talk where a Obama administration official who worked in the energy sector in particular was kind of just discussing the challenges of fighting poverty and fighting climate change simultaneously. And I thought he did a fantastic job of talking about the real hardship that people who don't live with fossil fuels face in terms of their everyday lives, and also the ironic effect that as they end up consuming more fossil fuels, we'll end up feeling the costs of that a little bit more. To what extent do you think it's possible to fight poverty and climate change at the same time? And to what extent do you think there's a real tension there?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's sort of the question of one of the great questions of our time. And I think there clearly is a tension there. We are huge consumers in the U.S. We're just almost off the charts consumers. If everyone in the world lived the way we did, it would be completely game over. Is there a way to feed people better? A lot of people, 800 million people, are still go to bed hungry every night on this planet. Is there a way to feed people? Is there a way to educate people? Is there a way to raise people? And many, many people are living in destitution without increasing not just the fossil fuel footprint, but the whole consumption footprint, which is, goes unfortunately even beyond fossil fuels, land use, all of these issues. And that is a question that I can honestly say I cannot answer. But I think it is absolutely at the heart of the matter, and it also gets to this idea, I don't think, and this is one woman's opinion, I don't think we are going to, all be able to live the way we do now and just, magically get our energy from somewhere else. There used to be in climate circles, policy circles, this idea of convergence. It's not really fair for some people to consume massive amounts and other people not to. That has kind of dropped away out of the conversation because it's so toxic, right? If you tell Americans, well, we just can't live this way, it's just not tenable, no one's very happy. So I think these are humongous questions. They're absolutely the questions.
Thanks for your presentation. In the chapter entitled The New Pangea, you have an excellent discussion about invasive plant and animal species. What more should be done to deal with this problem?
Well, that is a really big issue, right here in Chicago, because the Great Lakes are very, very seriously invaded, one of the most invaded bodies of water, you have right out here, there's like almost 200 invasive species established in the Great Lakes. They've completely transformed the ecology of the Great Lakes. So, one thing that people would say in terms of aquatic invasive species is we need to be a lot more careful what we're letting in terms of ballast water. All of these are resisted tremendously, all the measures that are proposed in terms of sort of zapping ballast water before you can release it. They're really resisted by the shipping industry. They add costs. But that is a huge, huge issue. And then, we're such a globalized world that everything is moving around. I mean, I think there's a figure in the book, 10,000 species moving around the world every day.
One of those species is the emerald ash borer, which has absolutely wrought havoc in the United States. I don't know how many trees, hundreds of millions probably, and just driving across the Midwest, I noticed what should be healthy-looking forests have so many dead trees in them now. Is the converse going on? Do you know, are we exporting a lot of stuff as well to China or other parts of the world that are destroying their environments?
Would that make us feel better? Yeah.
Not that I'm keeping score, but I wondered.
Yeah, well, I think that, once again, I'm not an expert on this, but, yes, every continent, like New Zealand is, for example, is a place that they feel very, very, they've suffered terribly from invasive species. Some of that is their own doing and some of it is not, but they also export species. The New Zealand mud snail, is something that's here a big problem here in the U.S. and something that some kind of creature, I forget what it is, that creates what looks like snot. Also comes from New Zealand. So, I mean, I don't think there's anyone who's immune, any continent or country that's immune to the effects of invasive species. But all that being said, if you just track global, who's importing what, right? We're importing a lot more from China than China's importing from us. So, ergo, you're going to get more arrows pointing in this direction.
Thank you for your book. When I finished reading it, it felt like a book that needed 4 or 5 sequels, and hopefully you have the time.
Not sure I have that in me, but thank you. Thank you.
Final question.
Thank you so much for your work. For anyone wondering what to do, Clean Energy Lobby Day is March 4th. I hope everyone knows about the Clean Energy Jobs Act. If not, it is a state bill that has not been passed that needs grassroots advocacy. It is the work of over 200 membership organizations across the state. It would put Illinois on the path to 100% clean energy without leaving out our most vulnerable communities. We need people to come out on the 4th of March, come to Springfield. If not, I hope you're calling Governor Pritzker and telling him to get behind it, and your legislators as well. If you want more information, you can go to ilcleanjobs.org. So sorry for the comment, not a question, and I'm so sorry for the shameless plug, but I really had to say something in this group because I think we're all mobilized.
You all follow the directions when I ask you to move in, but the comment question thing, we got to get better on, guys. We are over time. I want to thank Elizabeth and Donna and all of you for being here tonight.